Welcome. I'm Andrea Cobb, and I direct the Galileo Science Cafe. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to give a shout out to our partner in crime, Michael Galvin and his team, who help us put on this wonderful event. We'll start off today with an introduction from our dean, Fernando Morales, who is himself a scientist and engineer, and he just joined Mason College of Science in June, and I know you'll be excited to meet him. Dean Fernando?
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everybody. Certainly exciting to be with you here in this evening, even if it's by virtual means. It is always great to connect with the community, be able to share the science that we're doing at Mason. One thing I wanted to emphasize today is that even through the pandemic, our research programs and research labs have remained very active, of course, with appropriate safety protocols and lots of health related measures taking into consideration and put in practice. But we've been able to navigate the pandemic with still doing our science, still working with our students, our younger researchers, our professors, and our research staff. And I'm very, very delighted to be able to continue to have this experience of sharing our science and our findings and what we do with the community. So today we have a very exciting presentation by one of our esteemed faculty. And I hope you enjoy it, and I'm going to stick around myself to learn. One of the things that excites me quite a bit about being dean of this college is that I get not only to meet the faculty and the researchers as people, but I also get to learn about the science that they do, and that's always very, very pleasant. So I'll leave it there, Andrea. Thanks again, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks everybody for showing up.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Lance Leota, who is one of the founders of Galileo Science Cafe. And if you've been coming to these sessions, you're quite familiar with Dr. Leota. He's been quite busy fighting COVID at one of our wonderful research labs, and he's going to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and pleasure to see you here, Fernando. So tonight, everyone, our thought leader and role model is Professor Frank Krueger. Dr. Krueger is an internationally trained and internationally recognized pioneer exploring the most exciting uncharted territories in science, the human brain. Dr. Krueger is an associate professor of social neuroscience at the School of Systems Biology at George Mason University. He was trained in psychology, has a PhD in cognitive psychology, and he has a master's in physics, an unusual, powerful combination of disciplines. He is chief of the Social Cognition and Interaction Functional Imaging Center at George Mason University. And as a trained psychologist and a physicist, he is studying the neurologic mechanisms of thought, how we think, what are the neurologic mechanisms of social awareness and social behavior. Tonight, he will discuss a timely and critically important topic, particularly for this year, the neuroscience of trust. Boy, we certainly need more trust in this world and need to understand the source of it. In fact, speaking of the word trust, T-R-U-S-T, he is the director of the Transdisciplinary Research Union for the Study of Trust. If you look at the acronym that creates, it spells the word trust. So we're really excited to hear about how the brain, what are the brain mechanisms that engender trust? Go ahead, Frank. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for taking time it's a privilege for me to present some research we are engaging currently. So let me start off with a general view what the mission is of my lab, and then I will go into today's topic. So I'm leading the social cognition interaction functional imaging lab. And basically, as Len said, so I'm very interested how our brain works and how it's encoded that we can make social interactions, that we can do things like being altruistic to other people, but also have moral standards. And today, I want to focus on one of my research areas. This is trust. So in our lab, we are interested in different levels. So we want to take a system social neuroscience approach. So we want to see how different systems outside the structural, the social interaction we have with other people, but how this is encoded in our neural systems like circuits and brain networks. So we always look at the behavior level. We're using paradigms from neuroeconomics. From economics, we have these economic games, which I introduce to you later. And also we have surveys, questions, etc., to see what people think. So then, as said, my background is psychology, so we build psychological theories about these constructs. So we look at what are the cognitive implications, the emotional and motivational one. And then we look into the brain, and we're using state-of-the-art imaging methods like fMRI to see actually what's going on when people making these kind of social decisions. And sometimes also we go deeper, we look at the hormone level, neurotransmitter level, and also at the gene level. And I think the exciting stuff is that basically most of my work is here in the middle level. So we look at the brain using these kind of methods. And here, from here out, you can learn more when you go down this way, but also if you go up about learning about the psychological processes and the behavior. And the whole idea is to build better biomarkers, because if we understand how the normal brain works in a healthy person, where there's trust involved, et cetera, we can see what are the deficits if it's not there, and then we can develop biomarkers to overcome those deficits. So today I want to talk about trust especially, and I have 3 topics, so it will be roughly 45 minutes. And then we have a discussion session. So first I want to introduce a trust framework. So in just general, why should we care, why it's important to know about trust, and also look into the brain, coming up with some definition. And then I want to introduce a trust model that we developed. So I want to give you a broad overview about the psychobehavior level of trust, what we know there, what kind of experiments have been done, and then also on the neurobiological level. And then there's a summary outlook, some conclusion, and future studies where what we want to go from here. So first, let's start with a trust framework. So the question is, to trust or not to trust? So I want to also engage you a little bit. So this is a typical question. Let's make it more applicable. So let's say you would see this person on the street, right? So the question would be, how much money would you lend to this person? And the idea is, it's just an example. You could give the person 0, 2, 6, 8, or $10. So I would like maybe that you use the chat, and maybe you can put in your answer. So if I would ask you this directly, if we would face to face, how much would you send to this person? How much money? And this is important because I want to see, also think about it, why you're doing this decision, right? Why are you sending a lot of money or less money? So let's wait, there's some information coming in here. And I think it's good. It's a big crowd, so we have a nice normal distribution, but most people would be more on the lower side. So they would send maybe 0 to 2. So the question is basically, we're looking at the face, and this is sometimes in direct interaction, actually the first cue you want to use, right? So how people look, if they look trustworthy. And if I would have shown you, for example, the picture, this is the picture right now, if I would show them this one, people would send maybe neutral 6. But for example, if I would have shown you this would be very high, it would be 10. So we're using these kinds of cues. So I could also do this. They have done this with studies where you take the same face and then you morph it. You show like the low trustworthy face, neutral, and the high one. Yeah. So, but this is only one aspect. So right now, for example, I can look at the face, but I could also give you a background information about the person. I could tell you about how reliable the person is, what kind of tasks or jobs the person is doing. So all the information you try to implement to make a trust decision. By the way, sometimes even if the person looks trustworthy or not trustworthy, right, it doesn't mean that the person actually is trustworthy, but we're using these kind of cues. For example, we are very good to identify if people is a trustworthy person. So we're looking at cues in the face. And here you see, like, if you morph at one face for less trustworthy to most trustworthy, and especially you look here to the eye, but also it's very important here in the cheekbones. So this is interesting nowadays in the COVID, right? So this is not for trust, but here they did a recently study about how to read emotion of people if you want to socially interact with this person for angry, disgust, fearful, happy, neutral, and sad. And you see actually wearing a mask has some implications. So for example, people really are hard to distinguish between angry and disgust. They're very like same, but also sad. Yeah. So this is just the cue. So think about it. Also, why did you make the decision? So there's always different processes involved. So there's the cues I see, but also do you have emotional reaction? And all I want to walk you through this, what actually happens in the brain when we make this kind of trust decision, for example, lending money to another person. So the next question is, why should we trust? So I'm lucky to choose this topic because trust is so mental, is very important in different fields, right? So I'm come from the psychology. So all our social relationships are building on trust. Mental health is depending on trust. In economic terms, if society is better off, if there's more trust, everybody is better, wealthier, the society is wealthier. And also on the long run is we study human trust, but also what's going on now is people focusing also on human autonomy trust. In the future, we will also interact with kind of artificial intelligence agents, etc. This is very trending topic. Also, this is again another topic where it pops up where trust is very important. Is this whole blockchain development right now, Bitcoin, this kind of digital currency, and here they talk about even trust architecture, trust is trust. So it's a very key component. But the question is now, what is trust? Right, so we have to define this because we want to put it into a scientific question, and we also want to see how people trust what's going on in the brain. So we have to define. We have to have a framework, and so this is the framework that I approach with my team to study trust. So we want to have a clear definition. We have a framework here, so we want to look at different levels, so behavior level, psychological level, also the neuro level. And based on that, we want to build a model. And the model is basically localized here that we have psychological component, but also what are kind of brain areas involved. And this I want to show you now in the next 30, 40 minutes. So right now I would talk just more about interpersonal trust, but also you can apply the same if you talk about institutional trust. So it's trust against different institutions among or between different institutions, but also you can bring it up in a higher level on the cultural level. So let's start with the definition. So this is a key point, and I try always to compare it with the parable with the blind man of the elephant, if you have to define what trust is. So if you go in the literature, there's over 70 different definition of trust. So if you ask the psychologist what is trust, if you ask the neuroscientist what's trust, if you ask economists what is trust, everybody would give you a different answer. So this is like the parable. If you ask a group of blind men what is an elephant, depending on what part they touch, right, they would say basically trust is like this or this. So this is one big problem also I try to overcome so that we come up with a working definition. And some people define trust as a belief or an expectation or an behavior. But I think it's very important to define what it is, because if you don't know what it is, you cannot measure it. So what we did is we came up with a working definition. And maybe I also would like to engage you one more time to, let's say, how would you define trust? So let's say I would ask you to create a Wikipedia page entry to define what trust is. So can you maybe put in the chat, so what would be the keywords that you would maybe list to that would include your definition? So what would you put in when somebody would ask you, what is trust? So I got some feedback here. So it's feeling safe, level of confidence, right? What else? Maybe reliability, freedom. Yeah. No risk. Yeah. So basically, and it's just, if you go to the literature and look at this, there's overlapping components that come up here. For example, thought, care, empathy, ability to believe. So if you break it down, basically, I would like this kind of work. I like this kind of working definition for a couple of reasons. So let me read it, and then I can explain what I mean by this. So first of all, we talk in this context, there's a lot of type of trust, but trust and reciprocity. I do something for you and I trust that you reciprocate my behavior. So trust and reciprocity entails the psychological stage. And here we define what a truster is, where the truster is willing to be vulnerable. I think this is one key point, vulnerability to the risk of treachery, betrayal, based on the expectation regarding the action of a trustee. This is the other person that will produce some anticipated reward due to reciprocation in the future. So this is maybe very complex definition, but it has a lot of things in general in common. So trust is not like just an emotion or a motivational, it's like, it's everything. It has a motivation effect, it has an affective component, and also a cognitive component. And those work together that produce this kind of behavior. So for example, here we could say the vulnerability, right? Because if I trust another person, I make myself vulnerable to that person. And then that's also why I'm trusting, I have expectations. So this includes cognitive processes. And also there's a motivation behind it. Why? Because I also expect some reciprocation in the future. So basically this, in general, from the point of view of a truster, is a kind of social dilemma because there's a lot of uncertainty, right? I can trust you, but also there's always a big question, will he reciprocate or will the person betray me? And then if betrayal is, this is a problem also in relationships, etc. And then also a question is how to rebuild trust, etc. And so it boils down basically to the two stages here, right? So in the beginning, when I interact with a stranger, I have no information about the person. So I have to rely, and I'm worried that it might be a betrayal. So there's treachery, right? But as soon as I can determine that the other person is trustworthy, the interaction is very smoothly. And this is the whole trick about it. So if we develop a lot of trustworthy relationship, so in the first time, maybe I don't know the person, I have to think about the person, I have to have a history with the person, but as soon as you know I can trust, you find the other person trustworthy, everything goes much faster and smoother. So this is the first thing, so how we define trust. So I want to switch now to a model. We want to use this working definition and want to see now how we can measure it. So my work builds on basically three components. So I'm a neuroscientist, I'm trained in psychology, and I also work a lot of together with economists. And George Mason has a very strong department, economist, and one of the leader in there is also Kevin McCabe, who developed the trust scheme I will talk to you later. So basically the approach that I showed you earlier on for when the mission of my lab is, so we want to see now how can we digest trust on different levels. So on the behavior level, psychological level, and then here today also I want to focus on the neuro level. So the neurofunction level, neurochemical level, neurogenetic level. And we're using now different approaches. So specifically for trust, we're using this kind of walking horse of studying how to measure trust, the trust game I will introduce to you. Then I will show you the trust component that important is that drives your decision to trust. Then we're using fMRI, but also lesion evidence from people, so to see what are the underlying large-scale networks. And then also we look at specific neurotransmitter hormones, for example, oxytocin, I will talk about later a little bit, how those are modulating our trust decision. And sometimes also go down on a genetic level. For example, there's the oxytocin receptor gene, which is related to oxytocin. And if you have an impairment in this system, that also should actually regulate up and influence your trust decision. And again, the same idea is, in my lab, we're using more approach for how the healthy brain is making trust decisions, but there you can learn a lot of that you can later apply to implement it to overcome disorders or untrustful relationships. So let's walk through all these levels. So I will give you some examples, most of our research, but also what other people did in the field, and give you like a taste of how you would approach this kind of agenda to see what is the neuroscience of trust and how is it encoded in our brain. So let's start off with the behavior level. And here I want to introduce you to the trust game. And as I said, this is the game which most people use. And I also introduce you, and this is very important that you understand the basic assumption, because most of the neuroscience that I will show you is based on on this game. So as I said before, we have two people, we call it the trust and the trustee, and they interact, and there's a social dilemma for the truster because he has to trust and the other person has to reciprocate. So this is the rule of the trust game, and I would like also then later to engage you maybe that we play it together, the trust game. So there's a truster and I endow him with some money, amount of A, let's say $10, or nowadays, if you want to play the game with digital money, I would give you 1 Bitcoin, which is pretty high right now. If you convert it to dollars, so you would say, let's say $10, and you can send everything, any amount over to the trustee, and that amount gets tripled by the experimenter, and then the trustee can decide how much money he would send back. And the money that the person A would send over A to the trustee, we would call trust, and the money that the other person sends back, we would call trustworthiness or reciprocity. So let's play this together. Think about it. So let's say you would play now with another person. You don't know it, it's a stranger. So that would measure it like kind of propensity to trust. How much money would you send over? If I would give you $0 to $10 you can use. And the idea would be then the money that you send over gets tripled to the other person. And then that person can decide how much to send back. So let's have an example. Let's say I would send over, let's say I would send everything over, just as an example, right? So I have 0 to 10, I have 10, I send 10 over, I have nothing now, 0. The other person has now tripled amount, so it's 30. And now the other person can decide how much the person wants to send back out of the 30. So here you see the dilemma, right? Because I sent everything over, right? And now the person can actually walk away because he doesn't know you, there's no obligation, but luckily, our brain are social hardwired that we actually have social norms and we trust and engage in these kind of interactions. So can you maybe put in the chat, how much would you send over if you would be the person A, the truster, send money over to the trustee having maybe $0 to $10 available? Can maybe everybody put in how much you would send over? So I see here 10, 5, 5, 10. Yep. So I think, again, it's this, it's a very good variation, and that shows you, right? I mean, not everybody is the same, so individual differences exist. But if you would do this now in different countries, then overall, people would send half of the money roughly. And I saw here a lot of people also entering 5. So out of the 0 to 10, a lot of people would put in 5, and that would be, right? Tripled now is 15, the other person, that other person can now decide how much to send back. But there's variations. So there's again, a Gaussian distribution. There's some people, they don't trust the other person at all. And there's other people here also in the chat, they send a lot. But roughly people would send half the amount. And this is also not so important. It's independent actually about this, how high the stakes are, right? So they have done the same thing also with thousands of dollars. So you could use your monthly salary, and also people roughly send half of it over. So it's like, it's a little bit dependent, but it's not really driving by. Maybe $10 is not that high amount. Okay, so that would be just the idea how much you would send over. And this would be, I would say now the trust is measured by that you send over $5. So let's play also now, you put yourself in the shoes of the trustee. So how much would you send back if somebody, let's say, sent you half of the money over? So he sent you 5 over, it gets tripled, you have now 15 as a trustee. So can you put in the chat maybe how much would you send over now back to the truster if you would have received 50? So here in the chat we see $7.50, $5, 12, 10, 7, 5. Yep. So you see also it's not right, it's roughly also half of it, but it's a little bit less, like 30–40% of the money what they receive. And again, there's also variation in it. But it shows you that basically how this game is set up, and it should mimic how we really trust in a real world. It's like now both people are better off because the truster sent something over, he had 10, he sent 5 over, he keeps 5, right? And then he gets maybe 7 back from the trustee, so he has more. He has 12, and also the trustee has now more money. So that the whole idea, it's mimic is that both are better off, and there's it's a start of a cooperation and of a social cooperation interaction. So the whole thing also happens in a kind of bounded rationality. So what does it mean is sometimes we have to make very fast decisions. right? We have limited time, but also limited capacity. And you're looking up some cues how to trust the person. I will show you also later, the more interesting idea is when you interact with the same person, you learn about the person and how to use this knowledge. So very important for the trust game is also, because we go inside the scanner, is we need a kind of control condition. If you put a person in an fMRI machine and you want to see what's going on when these person make this kind of trust decision, because the brain is always on, you want to have like another condition that you can make a contrast both of these decisions, and then what's left is what's trust. And how you would do this is you would play the same game against the computer. So everything is the same, the rules are the same, you have money you can send over. But what I'm doing now is the trustee, it's a human, and here it's just a computer, and we would say the computer makes a random decision. It's a random decision. It's like a lottery device. And what you control here for is what people kind of risk taking. Yeah. So besides actually trusting, it's also there's a risk issue, like a lottery component in there, and you have this control condition, and then later people in the scanner would play both games. And then you would stop, contrast their activation while you're doing this game with the human, with the computer. And then what's left, and I will show you later pictures, is what we would say is those areas are engaged in the trust decision. So a couple more specifics to the trust game. So it's a sequential game, right? So it's like I do first, I trust, and the other person reciprocates, and then there's a kind of interaction. And there's different versions. So I can play a one-shot version, which what we say is called trust propensity, how in general you trust the stranger. And then there's a multi-shot version where we develop a relationship, a trust dynamics. So this is important because sometimes you want to measure in general how people are trusting, but also see how they understand how people learn trust. Okay, so this would be our first component. Here's the behavior is how we measure trust, right? And here also, nowadays, you can also do similar games when you play with a human autonomy interaction, and I will come up later and tell you a bit more about this. So now let's go to the next level. We talk about the psychological level, the trust components. So this is what we established so far, right? So trust is the combination of these different processes, a motivational, affective, and cognitive component. Those together create what we call the trust behavior. And you have to make the decision under bounded rationality. And for you, it's a kind of unsocial uncertainty. It's a social dilemma. So to make it really clear that we're talking about trust is we developed the model where we used actually these different letters from trust. So I want to show you the model here that we developed. And I want to walk you through this. So trust basically has these different components. T is for treasury, R is for reward, U is for uncertainty, S is for strategy, and T is for trustworthiness. And the color you see is that is basically red means it's an affective component, blue means it's cognitive component, cognitive process is going on, and the green one is the motivational. So let's walk through one more time to when you make this kind of trust decision. So basically you start off, there's an uncertainty, right? Because you send money over, you are unsure if the other person maybe betrayed you, right? He doesn't has to send you money back. He can keep it. It could be, in this case, it's money, right? But interaction is energy you invest in another person, also time, etc., right? But for the experimental conditions we're using is kind of economic game. And basically there's an uncertainty, right? You expect maybe a reward that the other person reciprocates, and you have an uncertainty, which is basically, does the person betray me or does he reciprocate? And that uncertainty has to be resolved. And you can using different systems now. You can either go this route, we call it the social route, is you try to figure out how you try to get cues from the trustee. How trustworthy is that person? It's about maybe the face, what I showed you, but also maybe what you heard about the other person, the reputation, etc. Or you can do the economic eccentric. You just play it strategically, because sometimes I don't know you. I just put a little bit in and then see how over time it evolves. Yep. So this is like the setup. Every time it's a kind of uncertainty in decision, and you're looking forward to have a rewarding relationship, but there's always a danger of treachery, of a betrayal. And now we have to overcome this and have to make a decision. And you can use these kind of cognitive systems, which either evaluates the trustworthiness or the strategy about how to play the game. And basically, although we talk about trust in general, there's different types of trust, and I will show you this later. But if you play with a person and you never interacted, this is what we call calculus-based trust. So this is where the betrayal aversion is very high, because I don't know you and you might trust me. So I maybe go this route and maybe decide playing with you strategically. I put a little bit of money and let's see how you reciprocate, right? The other one is knowledge-based trust. So now it's more, if you would look into the brain, when people develop a knowledge-based trust, it's more like that they're using these processes to overcome uncertainty. So it's more like you figuring out the trustworthiness, you play a couple rounds, and then you develop this kind of trust relationship. And the most important one, this is where people actually say, this is what we mean by trust, is the identification-based trust. So this is like, I know you already, I see you, and I don't have to think anything. I see you, trust you. So basically, there's no cognition going on. It's just a pure good feeling that I can interact with you. Yep. So this is important to also keep in mind if we talk about trust. So what stages we're talking about: culture-based trust, knowledge-based trust, or identification-based trust. All right. So this would be a general framework, which we now could actually go in the scanner and look, see, okay, we would expect if this would be true, is so there should be areas related to reward processing, emotional processes when I put some person in the scanner and measure, but also there should be cognitive processes. So let's go now on the large scale network. So we're using mostly fMRI. This is a method to put you in an fMRI machine. And basically what it does is, I want to see the areas that are related to trust. So here it would be your decision, you make a trust decision, and it's very important. So fMRI, although it's a fancy tool, it doesn't measure actually your it's a byproduct of your neurofiring. So there would be neuroactivity, and that changes the neurovascular coupling, and then there's a hemodynamic response. So the brain area that you're using to make a decision is now using up oxygen and glucose. And what it's changing is the hemodynamic response, because more oxygen and glucose has to produce to this different brain area. And that is actually what I can pick up with my fMRI machine. And then you can, because from the physical point of view is the hemodynamic response. So you have hemoglobin, and hemoglobin can be bounded to oxygen or not. So you have de-oxygenated hemoglobin. And if the ratio is changing because this area is used to make a decision, is that area also changes the magnetic properties, because deoxygenated and oxygenated hemoglobin have different magnetic properties, which I can pick up with my fMRI machine. And then you can basically put that in pre-processes, and what you have as an outcome is these kind of brain activation patterns. So the whole process, what we measure if you put a person in and place the game inside the fMRI machine, is it's a bolt oxygen level dependent, the bolt signal. And here's one more time the kind of what's going on in your brain, right? So there would be a neurofiring activation. When you send money over, you trust somebody, it would change the blood flow. It would change the distribution of that brain area for deoxygenated oxygenated hemoglobin. That changes my signal that I can pick up with my fMRI machine. And it's actually a very slow process here. It takes 6 seconds to peak, and then it's very slow, goes down. So this is the underlying that I can actually use it to see what's going on in the brain. And I want to show you some pictures how it looks like. But this is the process so that you, fMRI has a very good spatial resolution, not so good on the temporal resolution, but I can see deep brain area. I can use other methods like EEG to see very fast decision making. This is very good for EEG, but I don't get a very good picture about the brain structure. So fMRI is very good. And mostly what we do in our field is we combine those methods so that you get the best out of it. Yeah. So, and as I said, sometimes we have to use a control condition, because if I make my decision, the brain is always active. So I would play the same game with a computer, and then I can later make a contrast how the picture looks like when I play with a human versus when I play with the lottery version. And what's left is these are the areas that might be that are engaged in trust. There's also fMRI, it's like a correlation. So sometimes those are areas popping up that are maybe supporting the decision, but not very crucial for trust. So there's always important to have maybe evidence. So, and one idea is you can have lesion evidence. So I was lucky to work at the NINDS and at NIH to lead the warfighter head injury program. So there was Vietnam veterans coming, like 200, we invited them, and they had a brain injury while serving in Vietnam. So they had shrapnel getting in their head, and basically had lesion and survived. And what we can have there, because we have 200 people, we have people with different lesions, so you can overlay that, and then we can analyze it similarly because everybody had lesions something different. And then what you could do is you could give them the same decision-making task, for example, playing a trust game. And if some of the areas are impacted by the injury, they couldn't make that decision. For example, if the amygdala was lesion, they make strange decisions. They send too much money over. But this is a very good evidence causality tool. So fMRI, it's more, you find a lot of areas that are related to trust, but it's always good to have these kind of other on the top experiments where you have lesion evidence, because the idea is if you have a lesion in that area and you cannot perform that task, that means that area is causally engaged in this task that you're investigating. Okay, so this gives you like an overview what's going on if I would put you in this kind of fMRI machine, which you can see here. And now I want to show you like an example. What we did long time ago, we did a kind of hyperscanning study. So this is like, I want to show you the idea. So we had actually people each in one scanner. So that person was in scanner 1 and that person was in the scanner 2. And we took pictures, mutual picture of both people. And they would always see, okay, I'm decision maker 1, I'm decision maker 2. So this was the introduction phase. And then they play what we call a binary trust game, but it's the same idea that the game that I showed you. So the person sees his picture, okay, I'm the decision maker, I'm the truster. And here he has to look at the binary decision. So sometimes in life, it's like you do not trust a little bit, you send $5 over. Sometimes you have to say, I trust or I don't trust. So the binary game gives you this decision, either I trust or I don't trust. So here, if I don't trust, I go out of the game and each of us gets 5 cents. And if I trust, it's not in my hand anymore, but the other person can decide, right? And if the other person decides to go this way, I get 10, he gets 15 cents. And if he betrays me, I get nothing and he gets 25, right? So this is the idea similar. You make yourself vulnerable and you expect that the other person maybe reciprocates your trust. So the person would make the trust decision, the other person wouldn't see anything. Then that person would say, okay, here you trusted, so he makes his decision. And now the truster sees the feedback. Basically, okay, I trusted, he reciprocated, and then there's a waiting period. And we did this now that they play it over and over and over. Yeah. And so you can study trust development over time. So how those two people over time develop a kind of trust relationship. And I want to show you now some picture what's actually going on in the brain. So here, I want to walk you through this. This is the video when they play the game. So this person now here sees, he makes a decision. So now the person saw that he made a decision. So now he has to make a decision. And then now this person sees what the other person has done. So you see like the brain is always active. So I want to walk you through one more time. So here on the left side, you see now a new trial. Everybody sees I'm decision maker as 1 or 2. So this person now makes a decision. He thinks about it. He trusts. So you see now not much activation here, and you will see now this person will betray, right? And basically then you see here, you see the decision, and you can say like the brain gets really mad. He's very not happy about the decision. So this is how the data would look like if you would actually measure brain activity, right? You don't see like one area, it's a lot of areas. So you have to analyze it. And then what you get is this kind of networks. So this we have done now over and over, and there in the literature, there's around 30, 40 of these fMRI studies where you can put people in an fMRI scanner and then see what are the underlying fMRI correlates about a trust. And let's relate it now to the model that we developed. So remember, this is the interaction here, this is our model, and we have different components, and those have different processes, right? Reward, cognitive processes, and also affective one. And overall, what you see is, so there's not one brain area that is important for trust. What we say it's domain general large scale networks. So there's always networks that work together. And we have here the salience network. So this is the area involved in your betrayal aversion. So that there's an amygdala activation or dorsal anterior insult. So it's not so important the areas, but the salience network is responsible for your betrayal aversion. So my gut feeling, should I trust the other person? So then we have areas, the green ones, that belong to the reward network. So there's different reward networks that are engaged, that are active when you do the trust decision. So then we have also these two cognitive networks. The one is the default mode network. These are the lighter blue ones. So those are the areas when I try to figure out, are you trustworthy? It's like a theory of mind. I put myself in the shoes to see what you will do, what kind of decision. And then also the darker blue ones here is the central executive network. So how I strategically interact with you. So this is now shown over and over that those areas are engaged, and it's not like one area, it's more how these different components play together and create what we call as a trust decision. Yeah, so that these domain general large scale networks, which you also would use on other social tasks when you interact with another person. So just a couple of things about what I said before, there's actually different types of trust. So we did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago where we analyzed all these different studies. At that moment, there were 30 papers fMRI. And because people play either the one-shot version or the multi-shot version where we can see trust development, so we can actually contrast these two conditions to see what areas are more on, if I play a one-shot, that means there is like a calculate trust, or if I play over and over and over with another person, how the brain activation changed, because I learned to trust the other person. And we can bring it down on this one here. So let's see, this was our model. So first, calculate trust develops. And what we see is what we control, basically, I don't know anything about the other person. We could call it the unknown unknowns. Yeah, it's a lot of high uncertainty because I'm not sure if you trust me. And you will see much more activation here in this network, the salience network. And here, if you see if you do the contrast in the meta-analysis, you can see this, the typical area, the anti-insula is activated. The right side is when you trust the person, but you're not sure about the other person. It's a stranger for you, right? But we would call it, the person still trusts, but we would call it cultivated trust. And it's driven by this unknown unknown. It's more the salience network that just drives your decision. If you develop trust over time now, as I showed you in the video, you play it several rounds. What you see is when people trust and get feedback, they use the knowledge-based trust. They use those areas related to the trust component, trustworthiness, and strategy. So when you look in the brain of that person at that time, you would see these brain areas lighting up. And then if you have established a trust relationship, we would call it the known knowns, because I know you now, I know exactly, and when I see that, I see the picture, I want to interact with you, I'm already feel rewarded to interact with you. And you would see in that moment areas activated in the reward system. And for example, typical areas, the ventral striatum, because you're expecting that the other person will trust you. So you can actually, using these kind of tools, paradigms, one-shot game, multi-shot games, you can actually look and see what are the different stages when you trust somebody, what brain areas are engaged. So just another example. So what I gave you is an example. I put you in a scanner and you do the task, but a new idea is also what they call task-free resting state fMRI. So remember, when you do a task, and here's an example, if I put you in an fMRI scanner and you have to open up and close your hand, your fist here, open and close, so this would be task-based, and this would be the trust game. You trust, and then the brain is active. The other idea is task-free fMRI. So I put you in a scanner, and you can, it's like a daydreaming. You go in there, open your eyes, and focus on a fixation cross, and you do this 10, 15 minutes. What you see is that these large brain networks that I showed you basically fluctuate on a very lower timeline. And you can analyze this, because the idea is how your brain works in the idle state when you not focus on one, but still the networks are active and they go up and down. So when if one network is active, the other one goes down. And how good they are working together or are combined in the idle stage, the better I can use them later. So they have shown, for example, in the development, when you are younger, a kid, basically your networks, these domain general networks, for example, here, the sensomotoric network, central executive network, salience network, they are not very well established, right? They all would go up in the same time or down. But then if you peak in your cognitive development around 18, 19, 21 years, they are very sharp, distinguished, right? One goes up, one goes down. And if we get older, this also goes back a little bit more, that they are overlapping. And you can use this now. And the idea is, right, the better they are working independent of each other, the better those networks work. And I can use them later in my task that I would like to do. So this is the idea, that I can maybe can I use my resting state fMRI actually to predict trust? Because those networks fluctuate in the idle state, right? And how good they are maybe fluctuate there. Can I use this actually to predict how people actually trust in a real environment? So here, what we did is, so you can put a person in an fMRI scanner for 15 minutes, and then you have this atlas, these different networks. And then what you calculate is the functional connectivity between specific areas. So if you look here, let's say I take this brain area, I take the bolt activity. This would be the area here of this area of the brain that is active across the 15 minutes here. And I take this bolt activity here, and I can make a correlation. And then I could say the connectivity, the correlation is the functional connectivity between these two brain areas. And I can do this now between all the different areas. And then I can actually put it in a prediction model. So you do an fMRI resting state experiment. People play not inside the scanner, outside the scanner, they play the trust game. And now I analyze it. I do a prediction model and try to predict basically, my resting state can predict their trust behavior. And what we did is we showed it here, you see the results behaviorally, how much people trusted. They play a one-shot game, how much, right? How many people trusted all their money over, how many people didn't send any money over. So it's a good distribution. And then we asked, can we basically predict based on the connectivity of all these brain areas how much they trust? So we can say, yeah, whole brain network, it can actually establish how much you can predict about the other person's trust. So the idea is basically I could take a new person and put them just in a scanner, and based on their connectivity, I can now actually say this person will trust 3 or 4. Right? So this is the whole idea about this kind of prediction models. And so maybe it's not so important in this context, but basically it shows the underlying cognitive processes is basically the same networks that are engaged in my real decision. They are also engaged in the resting state. And especially if you analyze now each of these networks, you can actually show that the default network is the driving factor. So the connectivity in my default network is actually driving the decision that I can predict how much the person is trusting. And then we could also do this for reciprocity. So just bring it back in general. So we can put the person inside the scanner and see what are the brain activation, but we also can do it outside, right? They do the game outside the scanner, we're using just the resting state. And all that I can use to come up with some underlying mechanism, how people trust and what are the brain networks. So 2 more levels, but there might be a little bit more shorter than the neuroscience levels. So we can talk about the neurotransmitter hormones. So one important hormone or neuropeptide is oxytocin. So if you translate it, it means quick birth. And you see here an example where it's all engaged and involved in our social development. It's called something the birth hormone, the cuddle hormone, but also the bonding hormone and the love hormone. Yeah. So male, females have it. Surely we know it from related to lactation, milk letdown, and related to birth, but it also has important properties for mental behavior in the childhood, in adolescent, and adulthood. So it's a real important hormone. Neuropeptide, it actually activates, it works as a hormone, but also as a neurotransmitter. So you have it endogenous, but also I can give it a person. And the idea is sometimes to see, can I influence my trust behavior based on this hormone? So there's a model how it works. So basically, there's several studies have done. I give you intranasally oxytocin, right? Intranasally, and that has effect on your social cognition and prosociality. So, but in the beginning, this is now going on research 15 years, is we would say, oh, trust. If I give somebody oxytocin, that changes my trust behavior. But what actually happens is oxytocin acts on a much lower mechanism. So it changes your social salience, it reduces your anxiety, and it changes your athlete motivation. And that is actually driving higher social processes like trust. Yeah. So the idea would be, if I give somebody oxytocin, they might be anxious about betrayal aversion, but basically it reduces your anxiety, and that's why you trust. So, and it's also important, if I give you this oxytocin, you always have a placebo, so you can compare the real effect, the causality between both treatments. And it's also not like a on-off drug I can give you, like, right? It just depends on the task difficulty, the stimuli valence. Also, if I play the trust game with an in-group or out-group member, so that is also important. And also stable individual differences, right? What kind of attachment style the person has, if there's mental disorder or even the genetic level. But this is how it might work. So they have, and here's like a short picture how it actually looks like in the brain, the release of oxytocin. So if you look at the left picture here, the green area is the hypothalamus. And if you zoom in now, you have specific nuclei that produce oxytocin, and it can be released in two ways: as a hormone through your posterior pituitary. This is like as a hormone in your body, but also in the brain. Here it goes directly to brain areas, and they are connected. For example, the amygdala, the anterior cortex. So there's two ways oxytocin is distributed in the brain. So when you give now oxytocin, they did the study with this kind of trust game. So they did a binary trust game. And they had two groups. One group got a placebo and the other group got oxytocin. And you can see the oxytocin group is sending much more money over, right? So the idea would be externally given oxytocin is pushing the mechanism, it's reducing maybe anxiety or it's pushing your affiliation with the other person, and you send much more money over. And in a control game, when you play the same game with a computer, you don't see any effects. So it's very specific if you interact with a human. And then they did this also as an fMRI study. And the idea is here, you can see now what happens in the brain if I give somebody oxytocin. And here you see key areas, they're belonging to the reward system, but also to the seance system. So when I trust somebody and I'm very anxious, the seance network is activated, and this is a typical area, is the insula, but also the amygdala. But if I get now oxytocin, basically, my amygdala activation is dampened, and that's why I trust more, because I don't feel so anxious. I don't feel the betrayal aversion anymore. So this is a nice way of a causal relationship in science. So remember when we do fMRI, it's always correlational. I don't know the key area here, but now I manipulate the brain, giving you oxytocin. That changes the status of the brain, and that changes behavior. And this is a very nice tool actually to confirm underlying networks that we found based on fMRI. Yeah? So this is one idea. But again, there's also a lot of discussion in there. What are the exactly mechanisms? But this gives you like a taste about it, how we would do this. And then there's also testosterone, and they have a competing role. So we talk about oxytocin increasing trust, right? But if I would give you testosterone, it's actually decreasing trust. So the idea is, again, the amygdala, oxytocin actually is dampening amygdala activation, and testosterone actually is hiding amygdala activation. And this is the other mechanism. So they have done a study here, behaviorally. They give people testosterone in a placebo group. And what you can see here is they play the game and then also the control condition. And we see here trust reduces under testosterone. And for the control game, there's no differences, right? So we know from the literature that testosterone is basically boosting competitive behavior, right, of social threat, etc. And basically that makes you more aware of social threats. You think maybe the other person might betray you, and that's why you're reducing your trust. So another example of how we can confirm what we found on the fMRI level. We know the underlying brain mechanism, but now we're using causal mechanism, like giving the person testosterone or oxytocin exogenously, and to see if this will shift their trust behavior. And the last one, very briefly, so you can even go down on a genetic level. And there's two mechanisms. We can look at twin studies. When we look at the genetics, we can also look at single mutations. So give me an example on the twin studies. So they have done this playing the trust game in twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and in different cultures. And they show there's a genetic variation of trust between 10 and 20%. So it's hard-coded in our genetics. And but this doesn't give you what kind of genetics is behind it. And one big stream of research is the oxytocin receptor gene. So I talked about oxytocin, right? So this is the influence of oxytocin on trust behavior. But now there's also an oxytocin receptor gene which creates these receptors. And if you have a defective a mutation there, and it's a single mutation here in the oxytocin receptor gene, which is located in chromosome 3, that it changes your trust behavior. So we did a study here where we tested participants and we genotyped them based on their type on this substitution here. And we put them in 2 different groups, the G and the GAAG group. And we can see here, one of them is basically makes that the receptor is not working well. So we can compare this, and we can compare the GG to the AGAA group. And we can see actually if you have this mutation, that one single mutation is basically it reduces your trust behavior, right? So this is, we would call it the GG, maybe the good gene, and the AGAA, it's the bad one. And again, we did this with the risk game as a control, and we don't see it. So it's very specific, related to the interaction with the human, not with this computer condition. So let's summarize and give some outlook. What are the next steps on the horizon? So I talked to you about how we try to approach trust. It's very important to have a good definition, a framework, and a model. I talked to you about these different levels that we try to explore, and most of our research is here in the intersection on the neural networks. And I talked a little bit about the model, what are the components, and what are the underlying neural correlates. So the next one I want to just open up, and this is also for discussion, is so in what direction I will go now. So I started this kind of trust initiative. I want to show you a little bit about this. Then also in the beginning, I said, so we are switching out also to study human autonomy trust, right? We will interact in the future with artificial intelligence. So how they have to be built that we can interact with them, and also how we have to program them that they might trust us. And also one very good idea is about, trust is very related to attachment. So we have a new protocol. I want to show you a little bit about this. So very brief. So for the trust initiative, so I think the neuroscience can be a frontier, because the idea, what I always say, right, brain is real estate. So trust, even if you talk about different types of trust, it all has to be encoded in the brain. So neuroscience can be like an initiator to bring other disciplines together to talk about a general theory about trust. And we try this now. We put out this kind of research topic where we talk about towards a refined understanding of social trust. And also I'm adding currently a book about the neurobiology of trust. So the idea is to bring other disciplines in, and we are already quite multidisciplinary, because I work together with economists, with psychologists, but again, there's other fields we want to include, so that trust is very important in different fields, so that we have maybe an underlying neural theory behind it. So the other one is the autonomy human trust, and there actually, there's a new journal coming out. It's called Frontiers in Neuroergonomics, so the brain at work or the interaction. And this goes back to the idea of Raja Parasama, who was a professor in the psychology department and who inspired me 15 years ago. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he founded this name, neuroergonomics. And now there's also a section called social neuroergonomics. It's not ergonomics, economics, it's ergonomics. But here I take the lead, our team takes the lead to understand how is trust different, if I trust a human or if I trust an autonomy. And we have some exciting experiments running. And the last one is, it's called, initiative I want to create is the habits. So it's called Human Automation Bonding Interdisciplinary Translational Study, called Habits. So here we see actually, can we bond to artificial intelligence? So the idea is, right, you have your favorite phone or whatever, but if you have like a robot interacting with it, is it the same? Can that robot trigger the same mechanism that you trust the robot and develop interaction, social interaction? So what we're doing here is we have this eyeball. This is a robot, Sony robot. You can buy, it's autonomous, it can interact with you. And what we do now is I teamed up with people from Auburn University, and we want to compare how humans interact with dogs versus this artificial robotic dog. And people will go through, so Auburn will do that. We compare this, that students interact a month with an artificial robot and also with a dog. And then we put them in the scanner, and we want to see actually, is there similar attachment between human dog and human artificial dog? And this can be done. Auburn has a very good expertise on actually scanning dogs. So they did studies where they put the dog in an fMRI scanner and showed videos of their owners. And they saw that attachment system in the dog going on when they see their owner or a stranger. And what we do now is we want to put in, so the human interacts with the dog and artificial dog. So one idea is I put the dog in and he sees the video interacting with me, and I go in a scanner and I see how the dog interacts with me, and I can take my brain activation, the dog brain activation, and I can do correlation between these brains, and I get a activation map, and that should look like my my attachment network. So this is one idea. And then I can also interact with eyeball and I'm in the scanner and see eyeball, and interacting with eyeball, my attachment system goes on. And another person interacts with eyeball and also attachment system goes on. I can correlate my brain with the other person. So it's not like a task-based fMRI, what I showed you before, like a clear trust game with the other person or interacting. Here is you're watching video because everybody watches the same video. I can take this as a basis to take different brains and correlate it. And the idea would be, we want to show is actually that the same attachment system goes on when I trust a real dog and this kind of artificial dog. So this work is done based on two labs. So the one is the social cognition interaction lab here at George Mason, also the trust lab in the University of Mannheim. And also there's some other, a lot of collaborators who helped to create these experiments and carry them out. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. And maybe we could start now the discussion. And I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Frank.
Thank you.
We're now open to some questions. Anyone have any questions? You want to raise your hand?
They can type their question into the chat box. We had one question earlier, and from Carmen: how are differences between individual and baseline resting states, I think that was in the fMRI studies, accounted for? Because you and I probably have different fMRI resting states. So do you have to do a resting state for each subject?
Yeah, so each subject would go in the scanner for 15 minutes. And yeah, so, and that's the idea, right? If everybody else, if you and I would have the same resting state pattern, I cannot predict anything. We need variation. That's good. If I scan 1,500 people, everybody has a different resting state, and everybody has also trust differently. And I can use now machine learning mechanism to predict based on my resting state, the trust behavior. Yeah, so you need different people. And fMRI is a very small signal, so you need like hundreds of people actually to get something meaningful, reliable results. Yeah.
I have a question, Frank. My question is about the trusting of an artificial intelligence. Yep. As time goes on, we're going to have to trust our autonomous cars to drive us safely. We're going to be, we trust our the internet to, when we put in our credit card to buy something. But would you think that when you're trusting an artificial intelligence that there's less of a worry about treachery? I think we would worry that the artificial intelligence would make a mistake, but it's not treachery. Whereas if it's another human being, main issue would be treachery, where that person is gonna betray me. Is that, you see any, see that difference?
Yeah, because I think when you interact with the autonomy, it's the performance what it does, right? If in a human, it's more this kind of moral obligation. He should not betray me because the norm is I reciprocate. I trust and you should reciprocate. So they did behavioral studies where they varied the performance level of that autonomy, and basically if there's kind of like a very mistake done, which the autonomy should not done, you're done. You don't trust the autonomy anymore. It's very hard to recover the trust. For example, if a human betrays you, there's always the chance of recovering this trust relationship. And with the autonomy, if they do this experiment, they vary the performance, and the autonomy should make an error, but it doesn't error. For example, in the car case or internet with the credit card, then trust goes down because he didn't deliver on the performance. So when you interact with autonomy, you focus more on the performance and trust based on their performance. And in a human, it's sometimes the performance, but also more the social obligation. But if you interact with social robots, actually, both comes together. There you look also, although they don't have, right, but you project a mental image into the social robot. It looks similar to you. You're expecting to behave like a human. So there you can also ramp up this kind of betrayal aversion. But I think on this internet level, et cetera, it's more, you're looking at the performance level, which drives trust.
And a corollary question is, if you're doing the trust game and you have pictures of individual faces, if you give information about that person, even simple, like their political affiliation or their religion or their job that they have, or their country that they come from, do you see differences in how people perceive their feeling of trust for them?
Yeah. So the problem with an FMI is a little bit, you want to keep everything constant, and you change one thing and then you do the FMI study. Because if you do have too many factors, you cannot really sort it out later. But they did it behaviorally, right? I mean, I see a trustworthy face, and they do it how much you trust, and then I added information, right? As I said, for example, the trustworthy face, it doesn't mean actually that he is really trusting, reciprocating later, right? But we're using it as a cue. But they have shown two things. Over time, if that person looks trustworthy, but he betrays me, I still keep up a couple rounds that I still trust him. So the first impression is very important. But if he does it over and over time, the learning kicks in, and I will give up my the reputation of the person, what I learned before, and then I adjust. But this is like, if I get betrayed from the person I trusted before, they showed also on the newer level, you stick with them 1 or 2 trials, but then other information overrides. So if I have a trustworthy face or a not trustworthy looking face, but I interact with the person now slowly over time, I would maybe send less money in the beginning, but if we have a good relationship, I would increase my my trust. Yeah.
So let's see, make sure there we go. We have another question regarding the trust of AI programmers, humans that control AI. Since this field is relatively new to the general public, we have distrust of artificial intelligence because it's novel, and especially distrust among older populations who are unfamiliar with their technology. So I guess that involves all kinds of scenarios. For example, older drivers who are maybe wanting to use self-driving autonomous cars, or I don't know, all kinds of other situations. What do you think about that?
Yeah. How do you encourage trust between a person and another person, or between a person and an artificial system? Do you have any strategies that you've developed?
Yeah, I mean, so what we're interacting more is we go more to the social robots. Yeah. So there, one big strategy is you make them more human-like, so that you evoke in the human, like my theory of mind module. So, right, we are hardwired to interact with human in the past, and we are the survivors of prosocial reality in the past. So if they have shown, if you're changing attributes of the social robot, and you can engage processes that are also engaged in human, you can make much trust in the other person. So one big thing in this social robotics is a problem. They look very human-like, right? I can make that right now very easily, but then they don't behave like, even the eye movement is different, or how they speak. I mean, the AI is not there, right? That they make their own decision, etc. And that will totally destroy my trust. So I have it maybe because it looks human-like. I can put my mental state on it, and I expect something. But then if the person not acting in this way, it will shut down, actually destroys the trust. So this is done then that you make it more human-like in a way to provoke this first interaction. And then I think on the artificial, so I'm not doing so much on the driving car. So for me, I'm interested in the social intelligence, artificial intelligence, like in a human way, that we try to recreate us, right? So this is the field we did some research on.
So here's a related question. I have a question about the RoboDog experiment. It's from Vala. Will that take into consideration facial cues, which you were just talking about? For example, will the person still trust a normal dog with a growl or a RoboDog with a growl?
Yeah. So the cueing is very important. So what we're doing is, right, we don't focus it on one, the whole session, right? So they play with the dog, or they teach them tricks the dog. So they have shown in real dogs is they have measured oxytocin in a human and also in the dog when they interact. So there's a lot of eye gazing on, right? The human one and the real dog. And they see this is like a feedback loop. So I release oxytocin, I interact with the dog release oxytocin, interacts with me, and that makes the bond. Ivor is programmed like this. He has, I mean, if you look at the picture, he has very cute eyes, and it's programmed, and he comes to you, etc. So they program in autonomous some mechanisms so that triggers our social mechanism. So over time, I think there's studies out there like where they showed Ivor about kids or adults, and they interact a while with the dog before they think, oh, it's just an artificial machine. But over time, they call Ivor comes. If you don't interact, then he comes to you and wants to interact with you. So that triggers in you those cues.
Very cool. Yeah, we have a couple of more great questions. The next one, have you followed up on frustrative, non-reward responses? Example is kicking the Coke machine that doesn't produce a Coke. Yep, been there. That occur when a trusted trustee betrays the trustor. Does oxytocin have a role there? Are there less of these frustrative responses in the oxytocin group?
Yeah, I think basically what oxytocin is doing is it dampens your amygdala activation. So amygdala is always for threat or anger, right? So I'm easily get angry in a situation, but oxytocin is lowering this one, and basically you would tolerate more, and that basically you are still willing more to trust. For example, what they have done is in autistics kids, they have also done now, so these kind of experiments is more like a show effect, right? I give it to normal people and then I see a change trust. But there's actually now treatment trials on, they try to put it on clinical population and do treatment trials. And one is, for example, human autistic people have problems actually to socially interact with other people. And when they look at the face, they don't actually look at the face, at the eyes in the face, they look more to the mouth. And normal humans without autistic, they would look more on the faces. So if you give a autistic population oxytocin, actually now it makes the faces of the other person more salient. So they focus actually more on the eyes, and they can much better make decisions now. So oxytocin can regulate it. And the best example is this, what I said for the autistic population. They get actually much more pro-social interaction. So the idea is oxytocin, you should not take it like a drug every day and then you're trusting more. They use it as a starting intervention. So I give you oxytocin, you more salience now to your environment, and then you have a training paradigm, and then you can train it. But the oxytocin kicks it in so that they focus more on the faces and you can interact then with the other person.
Oh, that's fascinating. Here's another one. Have any of your findings been examined cross-culturally? I wonder if, example, individuals from more collective cultures might display different patterns of trust.
Yeah. So again, more behaviorally, not on the imaging side. Imaging, we always want to do something like this. And if they have done it, it's mostly, so when they studies here in the US, they take them Chinese students, for example, but they lived in the US, right? The perfect cultural difference for experiment would be I scan somebody here in Germany, somebody in China, and somebody in the US. And we know that actually the more individualistic the society is, the more people trust out-group, other people. But collective societies, they trust much more in-group. So this is shown over and over. If you would play these kind of trust games and you vary the trustee, and the trustee could be an in-group, out-group, you would see these cultural differences. And I would expect if we would do this in fMRI, because we know what kind of components is, so it would definitely see then differences in these networks which are introduced today. Yep. So basically individualistic societies trust more strangers because we have to go out there and have to interact with the others. Collective societies are more trusting basically in groups, your family, your in-group, compared to strangers. But that changes also now. I mean, have you been in Beijing or Shanghai? I mean, this is maybe rural areas in China, this collectivism. But if you go to the big cities in China right now, I think they are also very individualistic. So it changes also. And they have this world value survey, which they do, not a trust game, but they ask like how in general you trust other people. And you can look it up, world value survey. So they ask like 17 different societies, and you can download the data, look at this, and you see these kind of cultural differences there.
Very interesting. But maybe one more question, Andrea. I think we have time for one more.
Let's see. Okay. Yes. Any insight as to differences among varieties of those in different socioeconomic status groups? Example, maybe those with less financial resources, are they less trusting because they are accustomed to resources being scarce, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think definitely fMRI-wise, new imaging, no results, but there's no evidence for this. They didn't investigate it yet. But I think, right? I mean, I said in general, I mean, there are studies showing how society is structured. If you have more access to roads, more TVs, to communication devices, the society trusts more, right? And if there, so the ideas would be if there are less resources, then also trust goes down. So I would definitely there's some economic experiment. Definitely they investigated it, and I would agree with the idea is there's less socioeconomic status, less trust. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
I've learned so much, and I have a lot to think about, and I really look forward to hearing more about your work. Oh, let's see. I think, let me just make sure I've gotten everything. Yes, I think.
One more.
Okay, fascinating information, especially the oxytocin and amygdala concentration. So I just want the audience to know that we will make these slides available, and we'll also post this session on the Galileo Science Cafe website. We invite you to our next session, which is going to be on Thursday, March the 11th at 7 p.m. And we're going to talk about the need for physics in the next generation of medical scientists and physicians. So again, lots of interdisciplinary, brilliant insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Frank.
Dr. Krueger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.